Albert's Ghost, written by Shunterproduction, originally told by NWR 1991. The island of Sodor was in the grips of winter. It had come earlier than expected, and with it came the fog. None of the engines like fog. Long periods of fog and mist would bring about old ghost stories and superstitions amongst engines both large and small. Several weeks had passed since Donald and Douglas's experience at Ballyhoo Manor, but they were still rather shaken by the events, and the small railway engines would notice this when either Donald or Douglas came to collect ballast. "It's very strange," said Bert. "Donald and Douglas are two of the bravest engines we've ever known." "Whatever it was," added Jock, "it must have scared them good." A few days later, Rex was taking some empty cars up to the ballast mine. The sun was setting, and the fog began to settle. He was almost at the mines when he heard the faint sound of an engine's whistle. "That's odd. When I left, all the other engines were back in the shed. Mr. Duncan must have sent one of them out on an emergency task," Rex said to himself. The whistle was unfamiliar, but it was so faint he couldn't tell. He soon arrived at the mine and shunted the cars into a siding. He then puffed onto the turntable and was turned around for the journey home. It was getting dark by the time Rex reached the forest. Rex grew confused. He thought he could hear the sound of an engine's pistons pounding, which wasn't his own. The sound was getting louder and louder, and without warning, a gust of wind brushed past the little green engine, and then the sound disappeared. "What was that?" Rex asked his driver. "I'm not sure, old boy," said his driver, "but it mustn't have been good." When Rex returned to the shed, he told the other engines of his experience. "I just heard the noises of a steam engine coming towards me," said Rex, "and a gust of wind blew right through me, almost knocking me off the rails." "Come now, Rex," chortled Mike. "It's just your imagination working overtime. You were so taken with Donald and Douglas's encounter, it has tricked your mind to experiencing one of your own." Rex glared crossly at Mike, and before an argument can break out, Bert stepped in. "It's not as far-fetched as you may think, Mike," Bert said. "Oh, not you too! What did they do to you when you got overhauled?" scoffed Mike. "Do you remember Duke, the engine that we helped rescue all those years ago?" asked Bert. "Well, when I was away being overhauled, he too was also in for repairs, and he told me about the legend which our railway has possessed." "What legend?" asked the engines together. "An engine that ran on the old Mid-Sodor still haunts our line," Bert replied. Mike burst out with laughter. "That Duke is a very old engine, and probably very soft in the smoke box," he laughed. "But hearing the story might be good for a laugh." Bert sneered at Mike and began his story. In the early days of the Mid-Sodor Railway, Duke was the only engine to operate the main line, while the others were restricted to the mines and quarries. Duke handled both passengers and freight on the main line. He enjoyed the peace and quiet and never complained, but the manager felt that he needed help. So he went to speak with the old engine. "Now I know you don't mind hard work, Duke," said the manager, "but the rest of the board and I feel like you need a helping buffer with the goods services. So, we acquired a saddle tank engine from the workshops on the mainland. He should be arriving tomorrow." "Yes, sir," said Duke doubtfully. He had a deep feeling in the firebox that this engine would be very difficult. And he was right. The engine was called Albert. On his first day, the manager had assigned him to take some empty cars up to the quarry. Albert was not happy with this. "I'm supposed to pull those rusty planks?" snorted Albert, as Duke shunted them in place behind the small engine. "Indeed, you are a youngster," snarled Duke. "The best way you will have a good life on this line is to obey instructions." "And who is an old fuddy-duddy like you to give orders?" retorted Albert, as he roughly pulled the cars out of the yard. Albert's behavior continued in this fashion, and would ultimately bring about his grim demise. Many months later, blasting was to take place at the mines. Albert was rostered to take the train of gunpowder and explosives. Duke warned him to be careful. "You're carrying a lethal cargo," warned Duke. "One stupid move and you will be blown sky high." Albert just laughed. "I will handle the train my way," he said snootily. "I don't have to take advice from you." And Albert steamed away. Duke watched anxiously as he pulled out of the station. Duke had a sinking feeling in the firebox that this would be the last time he would see Albert in one piece. Albert was rough with the cars, and as a result they swayed violently as he raced along the line. His driver and fireman grew worried. "He's rough riding again," said the driver. "Yeah," said the fireman. "Anyone would think he was in control instead of us." Albert laughed loudly. "Stupid old engine, stupid old engine," he puffed. His luck was about to run out. As Albert entered the mine, he gave the cars a violent bump. This caused the first car to explode, setting off a chain reaction to the rest of the train. Duke was back in Arlesdale, but the explosion was so powerful it almost shook the entire valley. Soon the manager came running urgently up. "There's been a fatal accident at the mine," he announced. "Please take the crane to remove the remains of the engine immediately." "What are the casualties, sir?" Duke's driver asked the manager. "The crew and 4 workmen were killed in the explosion," answered the manager solemnly. Duke took a mournful breath and went about his grim task. He was coupled to the breakdown crane and left for the mine. When he arrived, the scene was a horrific one. Ambulances had arrived to take the casualties away, and on the line ahead of him, Duke could see the charred remains of Albert. "I warned him," said Duke, "but he wouldn't listen." The small railway engines gasped in shock. "What happened then?" asked Jock. Bert sighed deeply and continued his story. The men killed in the blast were laid to rest in a nearby cemetery, and what was left of Albert was cut up for scrap. Many months had passed, and life started to return to normal. but sometimes the sound of a whistle wailing in the distance can be heard. It's said that Albert's spirit still haunts the line leading up to the mines. The small railway engines were in awe of Bert's story. "It must have been Albert that I heard near the mines," said Rex. But Mike was not convinced. "That story was good for a laugh," he snorted. "Ghosts indeed! I could spend an entire night up at the ballast mines, and I wouldn't see or hear a thing. The only things up there that could go bump in the night is a stray car." "You'd never know," said Bert. The next day, the small railway engines were once again busy taking passengers along the valley and collecting ballast to be transferred to Donald and Douglas's cars. Mike and Frank were working at the ballast mine, shunting cars into place for Rex to take to the chute at Arlesborough. "What rubbish that Bert goes on with," chortled Mike, as he shunted the line of empty cars up to the mine shaft. "There may be ghosts on the big railway, but not here." Frank remained quiet, as he knew that if he said something, he would be dragged into a never-ending debate with the snooty red engine. Later that day, Jock had broken down at the bottom station, and Frank was called to take the train, leaving Mike up at the ballast mine alone. "Where are you, Albert?" called Mike sarcastically. "Show yourself!" The sun was setting, and it was time for Mike to return to the sheds. But there was a problem. As the workmen went to change the points, the lever wouldn't budge. "The points lever appears to be jammed," the workman reported to the foreman. "I'll phone for the maintenance crew to come here right away." But soon he returned from his office frowning. "No one can come until morning," he said solemnly. "So Mike will have to spend the night in the siding." Mike gulped as he watched his driver and the workmen leave the mine on Bert's train. The mist began to rise as Mike dozed in the siding. "Ghosts! Pfft!" he said to himself. "That lot will believe anything." Then Mike heard something. It sounded like a group of workmen talking amongst themselves. The fog was so thick he couldn't see where it was coming from. "Must be the night shift," he muttered as he closed his eyes. Suddenly, he woke with a start. The sound of a steam engine's pistons could be heard in the distance, accompanied by a desperate whistle. "No! It can't be!" stammered Mike, as the sound got louder and louder. And then, to the red engine's horror, the mist cleared to reveal the ghostly appearance of a blue saddle tank engine. Mike froze in fright as the specter stared coldly at him. And then, with a sudden blast of its whistle, the engine disappeared, followed by the sound of a massive explosion. "No!" wailed Mike. "It can't be true!" He closed his eyes tightly and remained that way for the rest of the night. The next morning, when the points were mended, he returned to the sheds. He was still in shock, and when he backed into the sheds, the other engines couldn't help but notice. "Hello, Mike," grinned Jock. "How was your night out?" Mike didn't answer. He had hoped what he had witnessed last night was all a bad dream, but try as he might, he couldn't deny he had an encounter with Albert's ghost.